Jimmy Page hitchhiked on a country road. A rusty Ford Cortina stopped. What he did next left them in tears. The A303 between Wiltshire and Somerset, on an August afternoon in 1982, was the kind of road that England produces in its rural interior, long and largely empty, flanked by fields that had been fields for centuries, and that would be fields long after whatever was happening on the road had been forgotten. It was not a dramatic road. It did not pass through scenery that invited attention. It was simply the road that connected one place to another, and in the middle of the afternoon, it carried the sparse traffic of a summer weekday, occasional lorries and occasional private cars, moving at the speed that the road permitted. Jimmy Page's car stopped moving at approximately 2:30. He had left Plumpton Place that morning for Bath, where he had arranged to meet a restorer who had located a vintage Martin acoustic that Jimmy wanted to assess. The drive was not long, perhaps 2 hours, and he had taken it without particular urgency, the kind of journey that a person takes when the destination is real, but the journey itself is also welcome. An occasion for the kind of thinking that moving through a landscape at speed produces. The thinking that is not directed at anything specific, but that happens anyway, arriving at conclusions, or at the edges of conclusions, without being sought. The Jaguar had been behaving well until the moment it did not. The engine produced a sound that was not a Jaguar sound, a cough, and then a stutter, and then the specific silence of machinery that has stopped for reasons it declines to explain, and Jimmy managed to bring the car to the verge before it fully ceased to cooperate. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment, with the specific quality of stillness that arrives when something has gone wrong, and the options for addressing it have not yet been assessed. He assessed them. The road stretched in both directions without visible habitation. The fields on either side offered nothing in the way of assistance. He had a phone, because it was 1982, and the mobile phones that existed were the kind that worked approximately half the time and in approximately half the locations in England. And this location on the A303 on an August afternoon was apparently not among the half where the signal was present. He tried twice and received nothing. He got out of the car and stood on the verge. The afternoon was warm, and the sky had the particular quality of an English August sky that has decided, at least temporarily, to be properly summer. A lorry passed without slowing. A car passed without slowing. Another car slowed, as if considering stopping, and then accelerated again, and continued. He stood at the side of the A303 for 12 minutes, watching this, and at the end of the 12 minutes, he came to the conclusion that was available. He extended his thumb. He had not hitchhiked since he was a teenager in Heston, the specific method of getting from one place to another that people use when other methods are unavailable and the destination is necessary. In the years since, the methods available to him had multiplied considerably, and the specific experience of standing at the side of a road with your thumb out had become something that belonged to a different version of his life, the version before things had become what they became. He stood at the side of the A303 with his thumb out and felt, under the strangeness of the situation, something that was almost familiar. 4 cars passed, none stopped. A 5th car slowed, and the window came down, and the driver looked at him, and then looked at the Jaguar on the verge, and said something through the window that Jimmy could not fully hear, but that had the general character of a judgment about a person with a Jaguar needing to find their own solutions to their problems. And then the window went up, and the car continued. He began to walk, perhaps if he was further from the Jaguar, further from the evidence of a level of means that suggested his problems were self-solvable, someone would stop. He walked for several hundred meters and continued to hold his thumb out, and the traffic continued to pass in the unhelpful way that traffic passes when you need it to stop, without acknowledgement or apparent awareness that a person on the verge is a person in a situation. He had been walking and thumbing for approximately 20 minutes when the Ford Cortina appeared. It was blue, or had been blue at some point in its history, the blue having modulated over the years toward a general brownish gray, in which the original color was present as a memory rather than a fact. The bodywork had the specific texture of a car that has been repaired more times than it has been replaced, patches and treatments that had addressed individual problems without addressing the general situation of a vehicle that had exceeded its intended service life by a considerable margin. The exhaust produced a sound and a plume of smoke that suggested an ongoing negotiation between the engine and its expectations of itself. The Cortina slowed. It stopped. The window came down with the sound of a mechanism performing a task it found increasingly difficult, and the man behind the wheel looked at Jimmy with the direct and uncomplicated attention of someone assessing a situation rather than a person. He was in his early 40s, with the specific physical quality of a man who has spent his working life in physical work, the hands and the posture, and the particular kind of tiredness that manual labor produces that is different from other kinds of tiredness. His name was Thomas Clark. He was a miner from the Rhondda Valley in South Wales, and he was on his way to Bath with his family to visit his wife's mother, which was the kind of visit that families make when the distances between them are significant enough that the visits are infrequent and therefore carry more weight than regular contact would. "Where are you headed?" Thomas said. "Bath," Jimmy said. "My car's broken down back there." Thomas looked in the direction Jimmy indicated. Then he looked at his wife, a woman of similar age sitting in the passenger seat whose name was Margaret, and who gave the small definitive nod that spouses give when they have assessed a situation in the same way as their partner and are confirming the assessment. "We're going to Bath as well," Thomas said. "Get in." In the back seat, two children redistributed themselves to make room. Daniel was 9 years old and had the quality of a child who is paying attention to everything that is happening, the watchfulness of someone for whom the world is still primarily a source of information to be gathered and assessed. Anne was 6 and was holding a small stuffed animal and looked at Jimmy with the frank curiosity of a child who has not yet learned that looking at strangers is something that requires management. "Thank you," Jimmy said, getting in. "I really appreciate it." "No trouble," Thomas said, and began to drive, and the Cortina resumed its journey with the sound of a vehicle that is committed to its task, despite reservations about its own capacity to complete it. The road moved. The fields moved. The August afternoon moved around the old blue car, in the way that afternoons move when a journey has resumed and there is time and distance between the present moment and the destination. "What do you do in Bath?" Thomas asked. He asked it in the manner of a man who makes conversation, because conversation is the natural accompaniment to journeys, not from nosiness, but from the basic human inclination to know something about the person sitting behind you. "Meeting someone about a guitar," Jimmy said. "You play guitar?" "Yes." "What kind of music?" "Rock, mostly," Jimmy said. "Some blues, some acoustic work." Thomas nodded in the way that people nod when they are acknowledging information rather than engaging with it. He was not, by his own description or his children's, a rock music person. He had grown up with the music of the valleys, the choral traditions, and the working men's club culture that was its own world and that had its own relationship to music, entirely separate from what was happening in London and then in the wider world from the 1960s onward. "Daniel likes rock," Thomas said. There was an affection in the way he said it that contained the specific quality of a parent who does not share a child's enthusiasm for something, but who finds the enthusiasm itself endearing, more than is probably good for anyone. Daniel, in the back seat, said nothing, but became slightly more alert in the way that children become alert when they are being discussed. "What do you listen to?" Jimmy asked him. Daniel named several bands. Led Zeppelin was among them. He said it the way a 9-year-old says the name of a band that means something to him, with the specific quality of something important rather than just something liked, something that has entered the interior life and set up there. "Good choices," Jimmy said. Daniel looked at him. 9 years old. Not yet at the point where he would know how to place this man in any context he had. Not yet at the point where a middle-aged man in a jacket on the A303, who played guitar and thought Led Zeppelin were a good choice, would trigger any connection to anything he had seen or heard. He simply looked at Jimmy with the evaluating attention of someone deciding whether this adult was worth more of his attention, and apparently concluded that he was, because he continued to look rather than returning to whatever he had been doing before. "Dad says we can't afford a guitar," Daniel said. He said it without complaint, simply as information, the way children state facts that are too large for them to emotionally process, and that they have therefore placed in the category of facts rather than feelings. Thomas said, from the front seat, with the matter-of-fact tone of a man who has learned to speak about financial constraints without apology. "Not right now. Things are tight. The pit's been uncertain. We don't know what Thatcher's planning, but none of it sounds good for the valleys. My father worked that pit. I've worked it since I was 18. If they close it..." He didn't finish the sentence. There was no need. The sentence finished itself in the particular way that sentences about things that are too large and too frightening to be named directly finish themselves. Margaret, in the front seat, said something quiet to Thomas that Jimmy could not fully hear, and Thomas's posture shifted slightly. The shift of someone who has been reminded that the difficult thing does not need to be the subject of the current conversation when there are other things that can be the subject. "What about you?" Thomas asked. "Where are you from originally?" "Heston," Jimmy said. "West London, working-class neighborhood. My father was in manufacturing." Thomas looked in the rear-view mirror, with the specific quality of attention that people bring to this information when they are from working-class backgrounds themselves, and have encountered many people who are not, and who do not quite believe in the category of working-class origins, when applied to people who have evidently moved beyond them. "Still feel like it?" Thomas asked. "Yes," Jimmy said, and then, because the answer deserved more than one word, "You don't stop being where you came from. You carry it. Sometimes that's useful, and sometimes it's just there, but it doesn't go away." Thomas nodded. This was a thing he understood completely. They drove. The conversation moved through the things that conversations in cars on long journeys move through. The practical and the personal. The things that people share when they are in the specific proximity of car travel that is close enough for honesty, but separated enough for safety. Thomas talked about the pit, about the community that had formed around it over generations, about the specific kind of life that existed in the valleys and that did not exist anywhere else, the networks of mutual support, and the collective culture that had grown up around the shared experience of shared work in shared danger. Jimmy listened. He listened in the way that people listen when they are genuinely interested rather than when they are waiting for their turn to speak, and what he was listening to was not just the content of what Thomas said, but the whole texture of a life that was being described, the weight of it, and the love in it, and the fear that was present at the edges of it. Margaret turned from the front seat. "You're very quiet," she said to Jimmy. It was not a criticism. It was the observation of someone who has been watching and has noticed something. "I'm listening," Jimmy said. She looked at him for a moment. "You look familiar," she said. "I can't place it." "I have a common sort of face," Jimmy said. She laughed, because this was clearly not true, but she did not press it. They were approaching the outskirts of Bath when Daniel, who had been managing a small radio that was balanced between him and the door in the way that children manage objects that they have been given responsibility for, found a station. The radio produced, with the specific quality of car radios that are working harder than they were designed to, the opening notes of Stairway to Heaven. The car continued. The song continued. Jimmy looked out of the window. Daniel looked at the radio. He looked at Jimmy. He looked at the radio again with the particular intensity of a 9-year-old who is connecting two pieces of information and is not quite certain what to do with the connection. "Mister," Daniel said. He said it with the slight uncertainty of someone who is approaching something they are not quite sure about. "Are you?" He stopped. Jimmy turned to look at him. "Are you Jimmy Page?" Daniel said. The car did not swerve. Thomas was a steady driver. But the quality of the attention in the car shifted in the specific way that it shifts when a name has been said that reorganizes the shared understanding of the situation. "Yes," Jimmy said. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Anne said, "Who is Jimmy Page?" "Led Zeppelin," Daniel said. He said it the way you say something when the saying is also an explanation, when the name is so sufficient that nothing needs to be added. Thomas looked in the rearview mirror. He looked at Jimmy. He looked at the road. He looked at the rearview mirror again. "Led Zeppelin," Thomas said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Jimmy said. Thomas said nothing for a moment. Then he said, with the specific quality of a man who is taking stock of a situation, "And you were hitchhiking." "My car broke down," Jimmy said. Nobody else stopped. Thomas seemed to process this. The information appeared to require some arrangement before it could be fully received. "We don't know much about rock music," Margaret said. "Thomas has his choirs. I have my choir. The children are finding their own way." She paused. "But even we know Led Zeppelin." "I'm sorry we didn't recognize you sooner," Thomas said. "Don't be," Jimmy said. It was nice. This was true. The specific quality of the past hour, the conversation about Heston and the valleys and the pit, and what it meant to carry where you came from, had the quality that conversations have when the people in them are simply people, when the conversations are not about who someone is in the public sense, but about who they are in the human sense. Jimmy had not been Jimmy Page in the Cortina. He had been Jimmy from Heston, the man whose car had broken down, the man who listened when Thomas talked about the pit. Thomas left him at a point near the center of Bath where a taxi could be found, and Jimmy got out and thanked them, and shook Thomas's hand, and looked at Daniel for a moment. "Keep playing," he said, "or start playing if you haven't. It doesn't matter where you come from. It matters how much you want it." Daniel nodded with the solemnity of a 9-year-old receiving information that has been identified as important. The Cortina continued toward Margaret's mother's house. Jimmy found a telephone box and called his assistant and said that he needed some things done and explained what the things were. 3 weeks later, in the first week of September, Thomas Clark came home from the pit to find a large cardboard box outside the door of the house. His name was on it, in handwriting he did not recognize. He carried it inside. Margaret came from the kitchen. Daniel appeared from wherever he had been. Anne followed Daniel. Thomas opened the box. Inside was a guitar. An acoustic guitar, a Martin, the kind of instrument that is immediately recognizable as serious in the way that certain objects are recognizable as serious without needing to be assessed, through the quality of the wood and the craftsmanship and the specific authority of something made by people who understood what they were making. Underneath the guitar was an envelope. Thomas opened it. Inside was a letter, handwritten on 2 sheets of paper. Thomas, Margaret, Daniel, and Anne. On an August afternoon on the A303, you stopped for a man with his thumb out who was standing next to a broken-down car. You didn't know who he was. You had a car full of family, limited space, and you stopped anyway. I spent an hour in that Cortina being Jimmy from Heston rather than Jimmy Page. I talked with Thomas about the valleys and the pit and what it means to carry where you come from. I listened to Anne ask the questions that only 6-year-olds ask, because 6-year-olds have not yet been told which questions are embarrassing. I talked with Daniel about music. That hour was a gift. I don't think you knew you were giving it. That's the best kind. Thomas, the valleys have produced something for centuries that the rest of the country has not adequately understood or valued. I hope that continues. I'm sorry for what's coming, because I think something difficult is coming, and I'm sorry the people who will bear it are the people who deserve it least. Daniel, there's a note in the guitar case for you. J.P. Thomas read the letter. He read it again. He set it down on the kitchen table and looked at it. Margaret read it over his shoulder. They opened the guitar case. Inside, resting against the neck of the guitar, was a smaller envelope with Daniel's name on it. Daniel opened it with the specific care of a 9-year-old who has been given something that the adults around him have indicated is significant. The note said, "Daniel, this guitar belonged to me. It has been on stages and in studios. Now, it is yours. Play it every day if you can. Not because you want to be famous or because you want anyone to hear you. Play it because you can't not play it. That's the only reason that matters. J. Page." Daniel held the guitar. He held it the way that children hold objects that have arrived from somewhere much larger than their ordinary world, and that they are still understanding the fact of. Anne said, "Why is everyone crying if something nice happened?" Thomas Clark did not sell that guitar. Not when the pit closed in 1984 and the money was needed. Not when other difficult years followed difficult years. Not when the practical arguments for converting it to cash would have been entirely reasonable. He did not sell it because it was not quite a guitar anymore, or not only a guitar, but something else as well. The material record of an afternoon on the A303, when they had stopped for a man with his thumb out and had been treated, for an hour, as the people they actually were. Daniel played the guitar, not professionally, not in any way that produced recognition or income, but regularly, consistently, in the way that people play instruments when the playing is for them, rather than for anyone else. He played in a pub in the valley on Thursday evenings, for people who came because the music was good, and the company was good, and the evening was the kind of evening that the valleys had always produced, full and warm and particular. In 2009, a journalist from Cardiff was writing a piece about the communities that had been changed by the pit closures, and was talking to people in the Rhondda about what the past 25 years had looked like. Thomas Clark told him about the afternoon on the A303. The journalist looked at him with the expression of someone who is deciding whether they are being told a story that is exactly what it presents itself as, or something else entirely. "You gave Jimmy Page a lift in your Ford Cortina," the journalist said. "We didn't know it was him," Thomas said. "If we'd known, we might not have stopped. We might have thought he didn't need our help. But because we didn't know, we treated him like a person who needed a lift. And he treated us like people who had lives worth hearing about." He paused. "That's what I remember most. Not the guitar, the hour in the car." He asked about the pit like he actually wanted to know, and when I told him, he listened like it mattered. Margaret, sitting beside Thomas, said, "The guitar is wonderful. Jimmy Page's guitar, sitting in our house in the Rhondda. I look at it every day, but the thing I think about is what he said when he left. He said it was nice, being just Jimmy from Heston. I believe him. I think he meant it. Jimmy Page has not spoken publicly about the afternoon on the A303. He has not given interviews about the Clark family, or the Ford Cortina, or the Martin guitar that arrived in the first week of September 1982 at a house in the Rhondda Valley. These things exist in the register of things he does not speak about, which is the register where the things that matter to him personally most often reside. On an August afternoon in 1982, a car broke down on an empty road. A man put his thumb out. A rusty Ford Cortina stopped because the family inside it saw a person who needed help, not a person whose name they would have recognized if they had known it. They drove for an hour. They talked. They arrived. 3 weeks later, a guitar arrived in a valley in South Wales. The guitar is still there. The talking is still there too, in the specific way that certain hours stay with people, not as memories exactly, but as something more present than memory, as part of how Thomas Clark understands what a person is and what a person can be, as part of how Daniel Clark understands what music is for, as part of how Anne Clark, who was 6 and is no longer 6, understands why her father keeps a guitar in the front room that was played on stages and in studios before it came to the valley. It was a lift on a country road. It was also everything else.